IHS, advancing decisions that advance the world.
Many of Nigeria's problems today can be directly traced back to the fallout from last April's general election, which severely increased the tension between the largely Muslim North and the largely Christian South, who have long been political and ethnic and religious rivals.
Nigeria in 2012 has seen a marked increase in militant activity and civil unrest throughout the country. The armed forces appear to be struggling to keep up with the operational demands that they face and the increase in number of attacks.
The Nigerian group Boko Haram is the fastest growing militant Islamist organisation in the world.
The background to the current tensions in Nigeria go back to the events preceding the last election in April 2011. Most significantly, the death of Umaru Yar'Adua, who's the previous president. He died while in office, and President Jonathan, the current president, took over and then subsequently ran for re-election, which contravened the unspoken zoning agreement between the northern and southern factions of the ruling party. The Northerners were aggrieved that Jonathan was taking up, basically before his time, the mantle, and that created a rift in the ruling party, the effects of which are still being seen today. Essentially, the Northerners have become rather uncooperative in Parliament, which has produced a situation in which the executive branch of the Nigerian government is having trouble pushing legislation through Parliament, leading it to be increasingly unilateral in its actions, such as the recent passage of the fuel subsidy bill on 1st of January of 2012, which led to widespread rioting, general strikes, and civil unrest. The result of which was, of course, that the president and the union struck a deal. The president had to climb down from his original position, further weakening him in the eyes of many. And also the fuel subsidy issue has made him substantially less popular with his base, which has in turn undercut a lot of the strength of his ruling mandate. The government is struggling to implement an effective security response, both to the ongoing threat caused by militant Islam in the form of Boko Haram, but also interreligious, intercommunal, sectarian tensions in the middle of the country, and also the after effects, if you will, of a long-running militancy in the Niger Delta. The decline of the militancy in the Niger Delta in 2009, 2010 corresponded with the rise of militant Islam in the shape of Boko Haram. And the Nigerian security services seem ill-equipped to deal with this new style of threat. They address the Delta militancy relatively effectively, but in terms of a more homegrown hidden threat such as Boko Haram and the threat of modern jihadist terrorism, it's less of an effective response. The northern support for Boko Haram has not been conclusively publicly proven, although a lot of analysts do think it is present. We had a case recently where a northern politician was suspected of dealing with someone who may or may not have been affiliated with the group. But the roots of Boko Haram in the north do go back to the governorship of the Borno State governor, various militia who were employed by, or thought to be employed by him and other northern state governors. So essentially what you have is this atmosphere in the north there's a disconnection between a lot of northern political elites and the southern power base currently. So Jonathan himself has admitted that members of his own government tacitly support and sympathize with Boko Haram. Of course, this hobbles the security response, to say the least, and it's making it even more of a challenge to kind of form an effective security response. The People's Democratic Party, the ruling party of Nigeria, has been firmly in control since 1999 and the new constitution. Their grip on power would not be threatened by widespread domestic instability, I don't think. The most likely scenario for an eventual toppling of the government would be if things in the country got so bad that it reached a tipping point and the electorate came out massively against the ruling party in the next election or the following election in 2019. This situation would come about, obviously, if the government is found to be grossly negligent in providing security for its own people, which is some of the accusations at the moment. Also, unless it addresses the crippling underdevelopment, poverty in many parts of the country. But all this will, I think, combine to create a stronger anti-PDP movement in the next election. But the ruling party has such a tight grip on all the institutions of state, the electoral mechanisms and everything like that, that I don't think it'll allow itself to be voted out of power in the next election. The government of President Jonathan has been under pressure from Western donors, foreign investors, and especially the IMF to reform its subsidy program, which costs the country about $8 billion US dollars a year out of their budget. The reasoning behind the move was that this $7 to $8 billion could be used on development projects, job creation, infrastructure projects, essentially things that would benefit the Nigerian population. Unfortunately, these goals proved to be too far distant in the future for the Nigerian people to understand. Essentially, it was a very short-term impact on their prospects, in that the removal of the fuel subsidy, which had kept fuel prices artificially low for years and years, and which was also seen by many Nigerians as one of the few benefits of living in Africa's largest oil producer. The speed with which they were removed on the 1st of January took many by surprise, especially since there had been only superficial consultations with the parliament, with the trade unions. So this has resulted basically in not only civil unrest, general strikes, but also of a breach of trust between the parliament and the executive branch, essentially, with many ruling party parliamentarians taking issue with the fact that Jonathan has completely circumvented the legislative process and unilaterally pushed these fuel subsidy removal through. The unions and the executive branch have come to an agreement reinstating the fuel subsidy at a lower rate, but still maintaining it, and the issue is due to be revisited in April and May.
Boko Haram pretty much seemingly emerged from nowhere in July 2009, because no one had heard of it before. All these clashes started breaking out in northeast Nigeria. And eventually the situation got so bad that the Nigerian military was sent in to crush the group. It turned out that it had quietly been developing hundreds of members, had a sort of complex facility in the Maiduguri, which is a city in the northeastern Nigeria. And the military were pretty confident that they'd effectively crushed it, and there was video of them actually carrying out extrajudicial killings of a lot of Boko Haram members. And a lot of them were also incarcerated. So it looked like it was sort of finished, done as a group, but until about a year later, just over a year later, there was a prison break, and they left a message at the prison where they had broken out a load of detained suspected Boko Haram militants. And essentially they said, we don't want to be called Boko Haram, because this is a sort of colloquial term that the locals refer to them as. We want to be called Jamaat Al-Sunnah Lidawati wal Jihad, and obviously that hasn't really gained much popular momentum as a name, because it's quite cumbersome. But nonetheless, these guys have since then emerged as one of the most deadly terrorist groups in the world. So it's been remarkable in terms of how quickly they developed into what is essentially now not an overt group. It's an underground group operating across much of northern Nigeria, and occasionally carrying out attacks in the capital Abuja as well. And there's this real debate around it, how much this is a sort of grassroots jihadist movement, and how much this might be involved in Nigerian politics at the same time, because Nigerian politics has a history of politicians have used militias to get the vote out essentially at election times, and there have been repeated allegations that Boko Haram had its roots. The reason it grew so large so quickly originally was because it had sort of the tacit approval of some politicians in northern Nigeria. And now there's an argument that other politicians who are disgruntled with the current situation are using the group and supporting the group as a way of putting pressure on the Christian president. And then there's also the debate at how much, the extent to which they have ties with Al-Qaeda or other foreign groups. There's been quite a lot of speculation about this, and the group is certainly wants to be seen as part of Al-Qaeda, being part of a sort of transnational jihadist movement. But at the same time, it's very much a Nigerian group. It doesn't do certain things that other sort of transnational jihadist groups do. It doesn't use the same internet forums and things like that. But people look at the tactics that they've adopted, the suicide bombings, their ability. They've gone from making very primitive IEDs very quickly to making large car bombs and things like that, and using suicide tactics. So a lot of people think that there must be some sort of tie-in there, that they've got training from was some sort of Al-Qaeda or one of its franchises. Basically, since the elections in April last year, the level of violence has been just going up and up, essentially, and mainly targeting the security forces, and also because the military's been sent in the form of the Joint Task Force. We're seeing more of an insurgency type violence, where they are carrying out IED attacks on military patrols and military vehicles and things like that. And so yeah, it's becoming a little bit more militarized. It's a little bit more like the sort of situations we see in other countries, maybe sort of Iraq and Afghanistan. So yeah, the military has become increasingly the target for them. One of their major issues is they always hark back to the crackdown in July 2009, which they blame on the military and the police. So there's this sense of vengeance that you killed our leader, you took him out and shot him basically, and you killed hundreds of other guys in a similar fashion. We want revenge.
In security terms, 2012 so far has been particularly turbulent for Nigeria. In January alone, there were 29 reported attacks, whereas in 2011 the monthly average was just 5. The February attacks in Kano and also the suicide bombing attacks in Kaduna on the Air Force Base and the Army base demonstrated a significant increase in capabilities from the Boko Haram. And so far this year, with everything they've had to do, the Army appears to be struggling to keep up with this. In a country of 120 million, a force of 80,000 is not particularly big. The Army makes up 70,000 of that force, and therefore they are the dominant service and the best funded. However, they don't seem to be making any inroads into decreasing any of the militant attacks. The Nigerian Army's main infantry is made up of 160 aging main battle tanks, just over 400 reconnaissance vehicles, and just over 300 armoured personnel carriers. However, in a country the size of Nigeria and against an asymmetric threat like Boko Haram, this equipment is of little utility. And it just seems that the Army has just too much to do. They've committed 5,000 troops, or just under 5,000 troops, to international peacekeeping missions. And while these missions give valuable experience for the troops, they do still keep them out of the country during deployment. In mid-January, we saw Army troops committed to the streets in areas of Nigeria, for instance in Abuja, Lagos, and Kano as well. During this time, the Army manned roadblocks on major roads throughout the regions. They cleared protesters from main squares, and they searched vehicles in those roadblocks as well. The Army also deploys alongside the Air Force, Navy, and police services and other security services in the Joint Task Force, the JTF. This force is deployed to the north, the northeast, and the southern regions of Nigeria, primarily for combating militant activity and also securing the energy infrastructures. Now, the JTF in the south have recently been restructured and have been given a wider remit of 9 states instead of the previous 6, stretching them somewhat at the moment. This also gives them less ability to send troops to the north if needs be, without affecting the security situation in the south. Overall, it looks as though the Army is not quite up to meeting its current security obligations. Overstretching its personnel and widening its footprint, therefore, will have a negative impact in the operational limits and decrease their overall effectiveness. If militant activity continues to increase in the north and spreads around the region, and also civil unrest returns to the south, the army will have a tough time coming up with any meaningful response, and therefore bringing the ability of the federal government to secure the nation into question.
Nigeria's outlook in the near and medium term is likely to be very rocky. Jonathan is being pulled in different directions by different interest groups, and the result of that is increasing powerlessness in the executive branch and increasing political deadlock. Internally, politics in Nigeria is becoming far more polarized, both regionally and ideologically as well as religiously, and this does not bode well for the near future.
To get through this difficult period of simmering civil unrest and increased activity by Boko Haram, the government should use a delicate balance of negotiation, restraint, but also useful directed armed forces deployments. And only by doing so will they minimize the risk of alienating a population that is still wary of the government and the armed forces.
The outlook for Boko Haram, I mean, at the moment, it does seem to be going from strength to strength, and I think one of the problems is that people don't really understand it. How much this is a product of Nigerian politics, how much this is a grassroots Islamist movement, because all the sort of socioeconomic factors are there in northern Nigeria in terms of the poverty, the politicians have taken all the money and lined their own pockets, etc. Technically, Sharia Islamic law has been applied in northern Nigeria a few years back, but these guys say it hasn't been applied properly. It hasn't brought justice and equality to the Muslim people of the north. So they're determined to make sure that a more hardline version of Islamic law is imposed there, and at the moment the Nigerians really seem to be struggling to deal with this situation, and there's a lot of potential for more sectarian violence, across the country.
IHS, advancing decisions that advance the world.